King Ahasuerus had just led a campaign that he thought was going to defeat the Greek army. He had built 2 bridges, if you remember, and overnight a freak storm destroyed them, and so he had the river lashed 300 times, and he threw shackles into the river, showing his dominance over the river, even though he was defeated by it. And he came home with his tail between his legs. He had spent 180 days preparing for that campaign. And during that preparation for that campaign, he wanted to bring his queen out in front of the people. And so we saw, as we presented this as a play, we saw in Act 1 this feast. And the queen, in that first scene, said, not doing that. It doesn't explain why. It just tells us that the king was not very happy. He was used to getting his way. And so in scene 2, we saw the queen impeached and removed from her royal throne, and then the king goes off to battle. He comes back, and 4 years later, we picked up the story in chapter 2, in Act 2, as we present this play, if you will, with the beauty contest, and how the young women were prepared for this. And we're introduced to a man named Mordecai, a Benjamite, a Jew, a great-grandson of one of the captives, and his niece, Esther, or Hadassah, who was strikingly beautiful, had a beautiful figure. That's what the Bible says, not me. And she was beautiful. But her beauty was more than just outside. She was a common person, but she was blessed by God. And she had beauty that can only be possessed by one who knows Him. She hid her background in the contest, but her uncle or her cousin kept a close eye on her as he worked at the king's gate. Esther, in scene 4 of this, chapter 2, verse 15, has her turn with the king, taking nothing other than what the chief eunuch said she should take, and the king was smitten. We ended chapter 2 and Act 3 with Mordecai at the gate overhearing a plot by 2 of the king's guards to kill the most powerful man in the world. He told Esther, who told the king, and saved the king's life, but nothing was done for Mordecai. And he didn't do it for the reward. He did it because it was the right thing to do. I think there's a lesson in that all by itself, isn't there? So we pick it up in Act 3, chapter 3, and we're inside the throne room of King Artaxerxes, King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes. This would be the king, the father of the king that would send Nehemiah to build the walls. This was the grandson of the kings that dealt with Daniel. Daniel was buried in the palace. Probably Mordecai knew him. And we're introduced to a man named Haman. And for whatever reason, Haman had wiggled his way into the king's graces. Probably because Haman was very wealthy And Haman knew just what to say and when to say it to make the king happy. It says Haman was an Agagite. Say that twice fast. Don't really. Haman the Agagite had become the highest ranking official. Now, if you look in the backstory of what it means to be an Agagite, there are some that believe that he was a descendant of King Agag, king of the Amalekites, 600 years before this. The commentaries that I follow reject this because there's also good evidence and inscription in Babylon that Agag was a province of Medo-Persia. And so probably he was just simply somebody from that region. The king honored him and ordered that all of his officials, verse 2, pay homage to Haman. Now it's interesting that this is a very clear order that they are to bow and pay homage. Mordecai sat at the gate. It's labeled there on your screen where the king's gate was. He was obviously an official in the palace. He was some job of some importance, but Mordecai refused to pay that homage. And in scene 2, as we go to the gate, we see Haman going in and out and Mordecai not bowing. But Haman hasn't noticed. Haman's too full of himself. All Haman notices is everybody's bowing down, and he doesn't notice this Jew in the back that is staying clear of all this. Until his co-workers inform on him. In the vernacular, they ratted him out. Remember that there is already and has been for some time among the Persian officials a anti-Semitic movement. Remember Daniel, who was very high official. What did the other officials do? They figured out a way to try to get him dead. Get him thrown into the lion's den because of his religious devotion to God. And so Mordecai's co-workers. Notice in verse 3. The members of the royal staff at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" When they had warned him day after day, he still would not listen to them. They told Haman to see if Mordecai's actions would be tolerated, since he had told them he was a Jew. I don't bow, this is the indication at least, because I'm a Jew. And perhaps he said, I only bow to God. Doesn't record as saying that. He says, because I'm a Jew, I don't bow to Haman. Now, Jews did bow to the king, and they did pay homage to rulers. It's unclear why Mordecai chose this, but he did. And in so many ways, it was Mordecai's decision that began a chain of events that would end in Esther saving her people. It was Mordecai himself that set off this chain that leads to the events, but God was already there. Where was Esther at the time when this happened? She was already queen. She had already been put into the position of influence that Mordecai is going to say, perhaps you're there for such a time as this, in just a few more verses. God was already before them. Aren't you glad that God is already in front of you and before you when He knows what's going to happen next? He's already there. You can trust Him. Even when you screw up. I think Mordecai screwed up. That's my opinion. We'll take it for that. I think that he set off this chain of events unintentionally, probably because of pride. Pride can get us into a lot of trouble, can't it? Can't it? Haven't done that in a long time. Can it not? I used to say that's a PTism. I used to say that all the time. I think it goes back to my mother's days in Kansas. Can't I? Pride. Well, the word gets to Haman, and so we move in our scene change to the home of Haman. Perhaps it looks something like this. Verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing or paying homage, he was filled with rage. I can just see him pacing the floor. What am I going to do about this guy? Trying to decide how he could bring him down legitimately. Because remember, Mordecai was an official. To just go order him killed would cause questions to be asked. And Haman needed to stay in the good graces of the king. Now, Haman did not know of the connection between Mordecai and Queen Esther. Nor did he know that Queen Esther was a Jew. She had continued to hide that. There was no understanding of that at this point. He decided he was not just going to kill Mordecai. That would make it look too targeted. He was going to kill them all. Absolute genocide from every Jew in the kingdom. That included, my friends, all the ones that had returned to the Holy Land to build the temple. Ezra. And what's that friend of his that built the temple? Zerubbabel, right? And all of those that had already returned. It included everyone in the city of Susa, everyone in the Babylonian Empire, everyone in the Medo-Persian Empire that was of Jewish descent. He was going to destroy them all. New Year's Day is going to be a fun, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day is going to be a great day in our home. We're going to celebrate. All right? Oh, she's not in here. Oh, good. We can talk about her. Listen, Zach, if you don't know that, I've set the date of New Year's Eve to be married of this year. And so that makes New Year's Day kind of special, doesn't it? New Year's Day is always a bit of a celebration. I think all of us really celebrated the coming of 2021 because we were tired of 2020. We thought 2020 was going to be perfect vision. You know what? It was perfectly horrible vision. Haman chose New Year's Day, the first day probably, because it was a day of special significance. It's the day when the gods were inclined to bless in their religion. And so he came to New Year's Day, and it says he cast lots. We don't know exactly what that means, but perhaps we can just think of it as rolling the dice. He cast lots, verse 7, and the lot fell on the 12th month. That's interesting that God would, in his providence, allow the Jewish people 11 months to take care of this problem. The 12th month, and we will later learn the specific day, he was the right time for a genocide. Oh, exciting. I got the right month. I can kill everybody. And so he takes his good fortunes of finding the right time, and he goes back to the throne room. In scene 4, we see the scene open in the throne room and the king in talking to Haman. And Haman tells him some lies. He has to get the king on board. And so his first tactic, in order to get the king on board with this, is he doesn't tell him who the people are by name. Notice verse 8. Then Haman informed King Hazurius, there is an ethnic group scattered among the peoples of your province and in your kingdom, yet living in isolation. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. His first tactic is, don't mention them by name. See, King Ahasuerus' predecessors had looked favorably upon the people of the Jews. They had allowed them to return to their land. They had allowed them to rebuild their temple and resume their worship. And so if he had mentioned the Jews by name and the king happened to do a little research or search his memory, he might say, these are people we're kind of being good to. Why are you wanting to kill them? But instead, he simply repudiated the people as a whole. This is his second tactic, to lump everybody into one. Is this not the epitome of racism? When you take an entire race of people, in this case the Jews, and you assign to them characteristics that are painting with a huge brush. He says they have different laws. They don't keep your laws. And you should not tolerate it. You should get rid of them. But that wasn't enough for Haman. He knew that he didn't quite have the king just at that, because the king could come down on them in other ways. The king was not going to do this expensive plan without lining his pocket just a little bit. And so Haman says, and guess what? I will pay for it out of my own pocket. Look at what he says. I will pay you, verse 9, I will pay you 375 tons of silver to the accounts for deposit in the royal treasury. I'm going to pay for all of the work. I'm going to pay for every stamp that it takes to send out the messages. I'm going to pay for every soldier. I'm going to take care of it. Haman obviously was a man of tremendous means. That got the king. He had no problems. Haman, whatever you want. I mean, if you're going to treat me like that and you're taking care of it, do whatever you want. In fact, here's my ring. I want to talk about the ring for a minute. Hazurius removed his signet ring from his finger, verse 10, and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jewish people. The king told Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with as you see fit. Okay, take your money, spend it as you need to make this happen. But the ring was important because the ring was a symbol of authority. The king's ring. Those of you that are married, look at your ring on your left hand. I have one. That's a symbol of authority. Given to you by your spouse. We just had a wedding, and it was gorgeous. And they exchanged rings. The ring is the symbol that you have been given the authority of your partner over their body, over their person. Did you know that? And that every time you look at that ring, you recognize that they have given you that authority. But you also recognize that you gave them a ring too. That gave them the same authority over you. It's a mutual exchange. Isn't that cool? So the ring was the authority to do anything in the king's name. It was absolute. Just as the wedding band is supposed to be absolute. Haman took that ring and did just as he had said. So scene 4 closes and scene 5 opens in the hall of the scribes. I couldn't find a good picture with scribes' desks, but I want you to just think about this having a lot of desks and people writing letters, because just 13 days after Haman had cast the lot to decide when to do this plan, he went to the scribes, and they were sending letters to every governor in every province, in every language, so that no one would be left out, that the Jews were to be exterminated. Verse 13, letters were sent by the couriers to each of the royal providences, telling the officials to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and plunder their possessions when? On the 13th day of the 12th month. Very specific. They had, and history bears this out, something to the equivalent of the Pony Express. But it was not cheap to run the Pony Express. It only lasted, by the way, in the United States, that only lasted about a year. And then the trains came. We still celebrate the Pony Express, don't we? Because it's fun. You know, they would ride from here to there, get a fresh horse, and keep going. And that's exactly what they did. And they rode to every province, every capital city, and they took these letters in every language that was spoken by the people to disseminate the decree to destroy, kill, and annihilate every Jew, from the youngest, like the little baby in the back of the room, to the most senior. Women, children, defenseless, it didn't matter. One of those letters got into the hands of Mordecai. And as Act 4 opens, we see Mordecai at the gate, sitting in sackcloth and ashes, and we see Esther in her royal palace, in her apartments in the royal palace. And so we have a split screen here, because on the stage are two scenes, because we're going to go back and forth and back and forth. And I don't know if you've been to a play, but sometimes they do that. They'll have two different scenes on the same stage. And we have Mordecai getting a hold of one of these decrees. And so he tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth and sat in ashes, and he went to the middle of the city and cried loudly and bitterly, but he only went as far as the king's gate, no further, because he couldn't go in wearing sackcloth. There was great mourning among the people. Well, Esther in her quarters, her servants knew her secret. And they reported to her about her father, uncle, whatever you want to call him, sitting at the gate in sackcloth and ashes. And so Esther got some clothes together from the royal closets and sent them out to him and said, "Please, don't do this." And he returned a copy of the decree and asked her to approach the king. Mordecai, verse 7, told him everything that had happened. This is the eunuch that Esther had sent. And the exact amount of money that Haman promised the royal treasury, Mordecai gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa, ordering their destruction, so that Hathach, that's the eunuch, might show it to Esther and explain to her and command her to approach the king. Interesting, Mordecai, the Jew, commanding the queen. Interesting, isn't it? Command her to approach the king and plead with him personally for this people. Esther sends back, "Listen, I haven't been in to see the king in over a month. And if I go in and he doesn't like it, I'll die. Unless he extends the royal scepter." Mordecai says, "Don't you think you'll die too? If all the Jews are exterminated, you will be killed too." I want to read that message, verse 13. Mordecai told the messenger, replied to Esther, "Don't think you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time," listen to this carefully, "if you keep silent at this time, liberation and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place." Mordecai understood the scriptures. Mordecai understood the promises of God to his people, and that God would not allow his people to be exterminated. That there were promises that God would keep. And he said, "Esther, if you don't do this, somebody else will. God will provide another deliverance, but," he says, If you keep silent, liberation will come, but you and your father's house will be destroyed. Who knows? I don't know. Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Perhaps God's purpose in making you queen is for this very reason. And we know that that's exactly what God was doing, don't we? Mordecai is not Daniel. Mordecai was not raised in the temple for the first 12 years of his life. Mordecai was not schooled in the Jewish law. Mordecai had it handed down to him from his ancestors. So perhaps he was not quite as in tune with who God was, but he understood this, that God wasn't going to let his people be destroyed, and he understood this, that God uses people, and perhaps God was using Esther. So scene 2 of Act 4 opens up in the throne room, and Esther goes in. Esther wanted them to pray for her, to assemble and fast. And then she goes in and stands at the door. The king spots her back there. I'm sure it was a long way away. And he goes, "Oh, Esther, come on in." And she comes, and apparently the tradition was if the scepter is extended, you touch the tip of it. And then your life is spared. The king says this to her. "What is it, Queen Esther? Whatever you want, even to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." He gives this idea. Here's what J.A. Martin said in Wolvard's commentary. The king sensed that she had come to request something. So he asked her for her request and even offered to give her whatever she wanted to half the kingdom. Apparently, this was an idiom to express to the point to Esther that she could request whatever she would desire, and that he would make sure that wish would be fulfilled. Anything you want, Esther. I have the power to do anything your heart desires. What did she want? Well, Esther knew that she couldn't just accuse Haman. She needed to soften the king up. So she invited him to a banquet that she had already prepared for her and for Haman. And the king, "Go get Haman, let's go. Sounds good." And they go. And we enter the queen's apartments and the banquet in scene 3, and the king again asks, "Whatever you want is yours." Have you ever watched the Veggietale version of Esther? How many of you watched the Veggietale version of Esther? Just my family? Oh, a few shades? Esther kind of acts frightened. She's not sure that she has enough courage yet. And so she invites them to another banquet tomorrow. I don't think that was it. I don't think that she chickened out. I think she's doing proper preparation. Wiersbe says this: "At the banquet we saw 3 more evidences of the sovereignty of God. First, the Lord restrained Esther from telling Ahasuerus the truth about Haman. While there may have been fear in her heart, I don't think that's what held her back. The Lord was working in her life and directing what she said, and even though she wasn't aware of it, God was delaying this great exposure until after the king had honored Mordecai." That's the next chapter. It needed to wait. And for whatever reason, Esther didn't spill the beans. She waited. You ever wonder? You ever sensed God working through you and you don't know exactly why you said what you said? I've had that sense in my life many times. I look back and I said, how'd they come up with that? That was pretty good. I wish I'd written it down. I don't know that Esther had any clue why she was delaying. Whether it was fear or whatever, it was the sovereignty of God. We also see God's hand in his sovereignty at working the way the king accepted the delay. He agreed to come to the second banquet. Monarchs, powerful kings like Hazurius, aren't accustomed to being told, wait. To man belongs the plans of the heart, but the Lord comes the reply of the tongue. Psalm 16:1. Many are the plans of a man's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Psalm 19:21. Whatever plans Ahasuerus had made for the next evening were canceled to make time for the queen's second feast. The third evidence of God's sovereignty is that none of Esther's attendants, who already knew that she was a Jewess, tried to convey this important information to Haman. Had Haman known the queen's nationality, he would have immediately devised some way to prevent her from interfering. Palace intrigue is a dangerous game, and any of the attendants could have profited by telling Haman what they knew, but they kept their mouths shut. Haman has no idea of Esther's true identity. Ahasuerus has no idea of Esther's true identity. And her attendants aren't saying anything, and she waits another day. Now, the next chapter, we're going to see Ahasuerus having a sleepless night. Anybody wonder why he had a sleepless night? Well, first of all, it's the sovereignty of God. Secondly, I think he probably had on his mind, what does Esther want? What could that woman need? Goodness gracious, I've given her everything already. What could she want, right? God used this delay. As the curtain closes on this scene, and we move to our second intermission, our audience is left in a state of agitation and anxiety, wondering why she didn't tell the king, why would she make him wait, what's going to happen next. If you don't look on past chapter 4, if you didn't have the rest of the book of Esther, you would be at a literary climax in the story. There's a second literary climax coming. We know God's plan is unfolding, how God is using Esther even when she didn't see it for herself. She was scared. She didn't want to go before the king. She was worried about her life. But her cousin, or her uncle, or whoever Mordecai is, or I believe it's her cousin, her cousin convinced her that she was in the right place at the right time. Where has God put you? Why has God allowed certain things to happen and not others? What doors, what things is God wanting you to walk through? As we see Esther waiting 24 hours to approach the king. And meantime, those that wish the destruction of the Jews are getting madder and madder. I have felt for a number of weeks in our land a tension. We are on the brink in our country and in our world of a breaking point. We see it overflowing in the land of Israel right now. If you watch what's happening in Israel and what's the response of the West, we see it. We see it in our own country. We see it with COVID restrictions and things being lifted and things not being lifted, and people are tense. You know, Christians, we have access to a peace that passes all understanding. And if we learn the lessons of Esther, that God has you right where you are for this moment, then we can have peace. Because we know that God is in control. No matter what happens around us. I love the story, and with this I'll close, of Peter walking on the water. Right? The chaos of the storm is around him. The waves and the winds are raging. The water is splashing on him. The waves are high. The wind is howling. It's dark. There's probably lightning flashing. And as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he was at peace. But the moment he took his eyes off the Lord, he began to sink. We sometimes get our eyes off the Lord, don't we? In the midst of things. But don't worry. Two things happened. First, the Lord picked him up and put him in the boat. And second, actually 3 things happened on this one. Second, the wind and the waves immediately calmed. And third, did you know this? They were immediately at the shore. I don't know whether they contacted the Starship Enterprise or not, but they were immediately at the shore. God not only calmed the storm, but he took them out of it and brought them to a place of safety. But we can have peace in the middle of the storm because we have Christ. Father God, we thank you for that peace that we can have in the middle of the storm. We thank you for the peace you gave Esther in approaching the king. And we thank you for the direction you gave to wait, even though she may not have even realized it, so that your plan could be worked out in its fullness. And so, Father, as we look at the world around us and we look at what's happening to the land of the Jews, we look at what's happening to our own country, and we pray for your will to be done on earth, just as it's proclaimed in heaven. And so, Father, our desire is to serve you and know you. In Jesus' name.